Here is Sailor, Illinois, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
And starting out, I have to apologize. It's only ever happened once before, but I didn't hit record, so you're going to be looking at video of me looking at the writing as we do this. Kind of going back to old school where it was written ahead of time. We'll see. This isn't just a blue as it appears, a slight purple lean, yet as I look at it, I get this, it's just blue feeling. I don't know why. There can be a little tone variation by pen, and in general, it does shade decently. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it looks basically the same. A real advantage if you use non-fountain pen friendly paper a lot. Now, I can't say that this would become a go-to blue for me, but I think it is decent enough to use up a bottle, just not for me to want to buy a bottle.
All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Levenger True Writer.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice mid-tone of blue. No feather, no spread. It does shade, really brings guns to bear when you look at weapons on the second line, where the W shows both lighter and darker tones. Now it lightens into the EA. The P becomes very dark, where the ONS lightens up quite a bit. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. You can see it is not cursed paper, but if you look at cursed on the third line, where the curse is rather lighter in tone, but the ED at the end get very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly well. If you look at gilded on the first line, the G is darker than the I, and the L becomes very dark again, lightening into the DE and beginning of the last D. It's the downstroke of that last D that becomes very dark. Nice shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can have no problems. Continuing our notes back here.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. And you get to see the way that I actually do this, where I really do have them side by side. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it shades about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at Deserted on the first line, where the DE are fairly dark, the SER lighten up a little bit, that TE become fairly dark again, lightening into the D at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly well. Take a look at Boats on the second line, where the B and the S are darker than the OAT in the middle. Shading, no problem. Not that everybody cared, but when you look at cared on the third line, most of it is one tone, but that D at the end does darken up quite a bit. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, they say. Take a look at they on the third line, where the THE are lighter than that Y at the end, especially during the downstroke. Now Starved next to that starts a little bit darker with the STA. The RV lighten up a little bit, that E just a little bit darker. The D a little bit darker still. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Think showing a bit of a purple kind of lean from this ink, showing that it is a little bit translucent and being affected by the tone of the paper. Now it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade shoreland on the second line. I didn't know how to work it in. The SHR darker than the OR, but the EL darken up a little bit. The AN become lighter again, and the D at the end does darken up some more, putting this one out to pasture with pasture on the third line, where the P is darker than the AS and the T darkens a little bit. The UR lighten again, and the E at the end nice and dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but showing just a little bit more purpley in tone. It's just coming through a little bit. No feather, no spread. It is shading about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I think the most notable thing is that with this paper, you are getting a slight purple lean. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, just a slightly different tone being that slight purple lean again. Result of the paper being a slightly translucent ink. Doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it definitely is there. If you look at ground on the first line, the G and the D are darker than the rest of the word, that round in the middle. Now there, underneath it, very dark. In fact, most of it is the darker version, but you see lighter words show up like was on the third line, surrounded by dark words. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue those notes back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, I think a little less than it did on the Clairfontaine. I'm not prophesizing about it, I'm just saying it's happening. Look at prophesizing on the first line. I worked that in so smoothly. The P is darker than the RO. The PH darken up a little bit. The E lightens just a little bit. The E, the N-ing at the end is a little bit darker again. Though on the second line, though the T and the O at the end are lighter than the H. That H is the darkest letter and standing out as dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Didn't mention it with the extra fine, really should have, but on this quad rule, obviously it's got no problem standing out. The quad rule really melts into the background, so not a problem. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not the greatest, it does shade well. Look at great on the first line, where the G, E, and T are dark, but the R and the E between them are lighter a little bit. The U next to that, U as in a bow, the downstroke of that Y is darker than the top of the Y that's quite a bit lighter. Now it stays fairly dark into the E, but that W lightens just a hair. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Sailor Yonaga. Here is Sights Cruisnack Pacific Blue. Here is Schaefer Blue. Here is Tasha Classic Blue Jeans number 5. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade some, not hugely, suddenly on the second line. The SU are lighter than that DD. The EN lighten up a little bit, and that LY at the end does become darker. Now, this is not known to bring out the shading in ink, but when it does, it is nice to see it happen. Sure, it stands out against a quad rule. Yes, it would be a great choice for students to use in their note-taking. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. It can be brought forward. Take a look at brought on the second line, where the B is slightly darker than the O or the ROUG. But it's during the end of the G into the HT that it darkens up a little bit. Now it stays dark through him and lightens up quite a bit with news after that. So interesting in how it's doing it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have some shading. Wait! On the first line, the W is darker than the A, and the I lightens even a little bit more, but that T at the end becomes quite dark again. Now, rising underneath it, the rise is a little bit darker than the IN. That lightens just a little bit, but that G at the end, nice and dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can happily continue our notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Krishna Bohemia. Here is Elixir Tangerine. Here is Robert Oster Australian Shiraz. Here is Noodler's Golden Brown. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Boy, oh boy, does it feather and spread. It spreads to about what the medium was on the Clairfontaine. Shading, who cares? I'm looking at this thinking, I don't want to use this ink with this pen on this paper. It crosses that line to where it is not serviceable to me with the amount of feather and spread that's going on, all combined. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers like a dragon that's mad about its gold. I don't know if they have feathers. We can act like they did. It spreads, and really not well, just because you get to see it on paper. Look at that compared to the stub. Yeah, wow. It spreads a lot. It really crosses that line into the unserviceable territory for me, and I would not want this ink on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade. It still doesn't make me want to use this ink on this paper. It is just gross the entire way and not a good combination. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is the lightest tone, but not by much in general, and it tends to shade well. Now the medium is darker and does shade better than the extra fine, while the stub looks pretty much the same as the medium with the expected line variation of the nib. I think the consistency of this lends it easily to being a dealer's choice.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.